Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a conqueror, but with a plant that's been confusing, healing, and mildly annoying governments for thousands of years: cannabis. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's smoky little history together. We're in roughly 5000 BCE now, the Stone Age, emphasis on stone. Civilization is still in beta testing. People are inventing pottery, domesticating animals, and dying of things like standing near a mosquito. Somewhere in what's now Siberia, a forager probably tossed cannabis onto a campfire for warmth, took a deep breath, and forgot why they went outside in the first place. Archaeologists later found cannabis seeds in ancient burial sites, which means someone valued this plant enough to take it to the grave, literally. Either it was a sacred ritual or a prehistoric version of "don't bury me without my stash." Given human nature, probably both. At first, cannabis wasn't about good vibes or philosophical musings. It was about survival. The fibers made ropes and clothes, the seeds were edible, and the plant was basically nature's Swiss Army knife. You could sail with it, tie things with it, wear it, and, if you accidentally smoked it, suddenly find the clouds hilarious. Imagine being one of the first humans to inhale it on purpose. No one to explain what's happening, no snacks, no Bob Marley, just raw confusion and a deep conversation with a tree that isn't talking back. Early humans probably didn't think they were getting high. They thought the gods had upgraded their vision. And yet, from that accidental puff, the legend began. A plant that would one day travel the globe, inspire poetry, trigger paranoia, and fund entire reggae albums, all starting with some bored Neolithic farmer who wanted to see what would happen if he set fire to his crops. So, before the word weed even existed, cannabis had already outsmarted us. It found the one species dumb enough to cultivate it, worship it, outlaw it, and smoke it, often in the same century. Humanity, meet your oldest love-hate relationship. Fast forward to 2700 BCE, where China was inventing everything: paper, silk, bureaucracy, and apparently the world's first medical endorsement for getting high. Enter Emperor Shennong, known as the Divine Farmer, which sounds noble until you realize it means he spent most of his reign taste-testing random plants to see which ones killed him. The man was basically the world's first drug trial, with no control group. According to legend, Shen Nung discovered hundreds of herbs this way, including ginseng, tea, and yes, cannabis. His book, the Pen to Sao Ching, reads like an ancient yelp for plants. Good for pain, gout, rheumatism, and forgetfulness. Which is impressive, because cannabis probably caused the forgetfulness he was treating. To Shen Nung, weed wasn't a vice. It was medicine. The Chinese didn't roll it up or pass it around. They brewed it into tonics, ground it into powders, and probably called it something wise-sounding like wind in the bones elixir. It treated fevers, calmed nerves, and made people slightly too confident about their poetry. By this point, hemp was everywhere, spun into rope, woven into clothes, written on as paper. Entire towns were basically built out of cannabis. You could live your whole life surrounded by the same plant. Your clothes, your scrolls, your fishing nets, and, if you were lucky, your mild painkiller. It was like living inside an eco-friendly bong. Doctors in ancient China took it seriously. They believed cannabis balanced the body's yin and yang, which is a polite way of saying it chills you out. It wasn't recreational yet, but let's be honest, every civilization that says it's using something for spiritual healing usually ends up giggling at shadows. So while the rest of the world was still inventing fire pits and bad decisions, China had already added cannabis to its pharmacy. Shen Nung might not have known what THC was, but he knew one thing. It made people stop complaining for a while. And in a world full of famine, floods, and Mongols warming up in the distance, that's what you'd call medical progress. While China was busy bottling cannabis into tonics, and pretending it was strictly medicinal, their neighbours on the open grasslands of Central Asia had a simpler idea. Just burn it and breathe deeply. Meet the Scythians, the horse-riding nomads who basically lived outdoors, looked like they hadn't slept since birth, and had a collective attitude best described as armed and unbothered. Around 1000 BCE, these people decided that death rituals were missing something, mainly smoke, not incense, not sage, cannabis. Greek historian Herodotus wrote that the Scythians would throw hemp seeds onto hot stones inside sealed tents. Within minutes, the place filled with thick aromatic clouds, and then, in his words, they would howl with pleasure, which is ancient Greek for someone's about to freestyle under the stars. This wasn't some small ritual puff either. They treated it like a full-body baptism in THC. Imagine 20 warriors, all covered in tattoos and fur, crawling into a tent with burning hemp and emerging spiritually reborn and slightly disoriented. The Scythians didn't have a word for relaxation, but this was probably the closest they got. The smoke wasn't just for fun, it was sacred. It helped them commune with the spirits of the dead, ease grief, and, let's be honest, make the afterlife sound like a pretty good deal. Archaeologists later uncovered golden bongs, yes, literal gold, buried in Scythian tombs, still coated with traces of cannabis residue. That's right, these ancient warriors died the way they lived, stylish, mysterious, and slightly high. You can't buy that kind of historical commitment. Other cultures eventually copied the idea. From Persia to India, nomads and mystics alike began inhaling cannabis smoke during funerals, festivals, and philosophical debates. Because if you're going to question the meaning of life, it helps if the air itself is giving you ideas. So while the Chinese were boiling their medicine and writing about balance, the Scythians were perfecting the ancient art of the hotbox. No fancy rituals, no incense, just fire, smoke, and an unspoken agreement. No one opens the tent flap until someone starts seeing gods. While the Scythians were hotboxing tents on the steppes, India decided to make cannabis holy. Because if you're going to inhale smoke and see visions, you might as well make it sound respectable. By around 1500 BCE, cannabis had made its grand debut in the Atharva Veda, one of the 4 sacred Hindu texts. It was listed as one of the 5 sacred plants, said to be a gift from the gods. Specifically Shiva, who, according to legend, discovered it under a celestial tree, took a few hits, and promptly entered a state of divine chill. From that day forward, Shiva was known as the Lord of Bhang, which is arguably the coolest religious title in human history. Bhang, by the way, wasn't smoked, it was drunk. Imagine a smoothie made of milk, spices, crushed cannabis leaves, and the vague promise of enlightenment. Priests, yogis, and festival goers would sip it during ceremonies, praise the gods, and then forget what they were praising halfway through. It wasn't considered rebellious. It wasn't illegal. It was sacred. In temples, cannabis was used to purify the spirit. In villages, it was used to tolerate your relatives. It was medicine, meditation, and mild escape, all in one convenient leaf. Festivals like Mahashivaratri became full-on divine parties, where worshippers stayed up all night singing hymns, dancing, and drinking bhang until they could practically see the universe vibrating. If enlightenment had a recipe, it was probably this: 1 part devotion, 1 part weed, and 1 unfortunate hangover the next morning. And while other civilizations treated cannabis as a ritual tool or trade good, India gave it a personality, playful, spiritual, and stubbornly human. It wasn't just a plant. It was a companion on the path to understanding the universe, or at least pretending to. The beauty of it all? No one pretended it was just for health. It was explicitly for joy, transcendence, and occasionally, forgetting that you had 10 more years of drought ahead. So while the rest of the world was coughing in tents, India elevated cannabis to divine status. They didn't just smoke it, they deified it. Because here, getting high wasn't escapism. It was enlightenment, with better snacks. While India was joyfully toasting Shiva with bhang milkshakes, China was taking a more serious approach, because in China, even enlightenment comes with documentation. By around 1000 BCE, cannabis had already made its way into Taoist ritual life, which was basically a mix of meditation, alchemy, and doing weird things in caves to become immortal. Taoist monks believed that burning cannabis incense helped them communicate with spirits and see the future, which, if you've ever tried it, probably looked amazing for the first 10 minutes and terrifying for the next 2 hours. In Taoist texts, cannabis was sometimes called the liberator of sin, which sounds uplifting until you realize it also made people wander into forests trying to hug clouds. Monks would burn it during meditations, claiming it helped them open the gates of perception. Translation: they got so high they could hear their own heartbeat in stereo. China's relationship with cannabis was complicated. It wasn't a party drug. It was a philosophical one. Taoists weren't interested in escaping reality. They were trying to merge with it, which is a fancy way of saying, let's get high enough to think the universe is our roommate. Still, the early Chinese were far too organized to let things get out of hand. Cannabis was carefully measured, mixed with other herbs, and written about in scrolls that probably smelled faintly of smoke and regret. You didn't just light up, you followed a procedure, meditated, and hoped not to levitate into a wall. Meanwhile, Confucians, those eternal killjoys, frowned upon anything that loosened the mind too much. The Taoists said cannabis expanded consciousness. The Confucians said it expanded laziness. It was the first recorded drug policy debate in history, and it ended the same way all of them do, everyone pretending to agree, then doing whatever they want at home. Through it all, cannabis remained the quiet companion of China's mystics, burned in temples, studied by scholars, and probably blamed for at least one lost manuscript. The result? A civilization that managed to turn getting high into a moral, philosophical, and bureaucratic process. Only in China could you inhale the cosmos, but make sure you fill out the right form first. By now, cannabis had earned its place in human civilization, not as a mystical herb or a shady vice, but as the overachieving plant no one could get rid of. You could smoke it, wear it, write on it, build with it, and probably eat it if times got bad. It was the Swiss Army knife of the ancient world, except instead of opening bottles, it opened minds, occasionally too far. In ancient China, hemp wasn't just useful, it was everywhere. Farmers grew it in massive fields, villagers spun it into thread, and scribes turned it into paper. The world's earliest texts were written on hemp, meaning human civilization was literally recorded on weed. Somewhere, a Taoist monk was probably inhaling the same plant another monk was writing, "Stop inhaling this on." The fibers were legendary, strong, durable, and resistant to decay. Hemp ropes held up fishing nets, tied together ships, and occasionally restrained the same people who got too philosophical after smoking the other half of the plant. Clothing made from hemp lasted longer than marriages, and was only slightly less comfortable. It didn't stop there. Archaeologists have found ancient hemp sandals, bowstrings, and even armor padding, because nothing says battle-ready like a soldier dressed head to toe in cannabis. It's possible that somewhere out there, an army marched into war completely surrounded by hemp and had no idea they were fighting inside history's first all-natural dispensary. As the plant spread west along trade routes, it conquered new continents without lifting a leaf. The Persians made rope, the Egyptians brewed it into ointments, and the Greeks, naturally, argued about its moral implications over wine. Everyone used it, everyone needed it, and everyone pretended it wasn't slightly suspicious how cheerful their weavers looked all the time. Hemp had become the quiet empire builder. It didn't need swords or soldiers. It simply offered strength, flexibility, and a faintly herbal smell that lingered for centuries. While kings fought over gold, hemp just sat in the corner, waiting for humanity to remember it existed. And eventually, they would. Not for rope, not for scrolls, but for smoke. The era of practical use was over. The age of recreational enlightenment was just beginning. By the time cannabis drifted into ancient Persia, it had already been medicine, rope, and incense. The Persians looked at this miraculous plant and, being Persians, decided it should probably teach them something about the universe. Because in this part of the world, even getting high came with a reading list. The Assyrians were the first to use it regularly, calling it kunubu, which sounds suspiciously like the word cannabis, because it is. They burned it in temples, not for fun, but for divine insight, which is ancient priest code for "we're about to smell colours." When it reached the Persians proper, cannabis quickly found a home among Zoroastrian mystics, who already had fire altars, cosmic dualism, and existential dread. All they were missing was a good mood enhancer. They believed the smoke carried prayers to the heavens, which, to be fair, it did, along with a few brain cells. Then came the philosophers. Persia had no shortage of people who enjoyed sitting cross-legged and debating metaphysics until everyone forgot what the question was. Cannabis fit right in. It dulled pain, softened the edges of reality, and made long conversations about the nature of truth almost tolerable. Ancient accounts mention that some priests used it during rituals to free the mind from doubt. Modern translation: suddenly, everything makes perfect sense, but not everyone approved. As usual, the ruling class caught wind of the idea and panicked. If people could reach the divine without paying temple fees, society might collapse. So cannabis began its long career as a suspicious substance, respected in private, condemned in public, and still passed around behind the incense burner. Persian traders helped spread it further west along the Silk Road, where it picked up new names, new rituals, and a growing reputation for philosophical chaos. By the time it reached Greece, it wasn't just a plant anymore. It was a travelling idea, a portable enlightenment kit with no instructions. So yes, Persia made cannabis philosophical. They turned smoke into spirit, contemplation into a contact sport, and a plant into a debate partner. And like all great philosophical discussions, it ended the same way, with someone saying, "Wait, what were we talking about again?" By the time cannabis floated down the Nile, Egypt was already running on divine bureaucracy. The gods had jobs, the priests had paperwork, and everyone was building pyramids without proper labour laws. Into this mix came cannabis, a small mercy for a civilization that had been collectively overworked for 3,000 years. The Egyptians, being practical, didn't throw big smoke parties like the Scythians or drink bang like the Indians. They used cannabis medically, which is to say, they pretended it was medicine, and then used it for absolutely everything. It appears in the Ebers Papyrus, a 3,500-year-old medical text that lists cannabis as a treatment for inflammation, glaucoma, menstrual pain, and, this is true, bad temper. That last one alone could have saved pharaohs from a few wars. The priests were the main gatekeepers of cannabis use. They mixed it into balms, oils, and incense for temple rituals. Picture a high priest waving a censer full of fragrant smoke while declaring it purely spiritual. Sure, and so is tequila. The idea was that the sweet scent would carry prayers to the gods, and probably made everyone in the temple feel a little closer to them. Cannabis even made it to the afterlife. Traces of it have been found in mummy wrappings and burial chambers, which means someone thought, if I'm crossing into eternity, I'm bringing a joint. It's hard to blame them. Eternity sounds long, and the afterlife was rumoured to involve farming again. Women also used it. Ancient Egyptian midwives prescribed cannabis to ease childbirth pain, which was brave, given there were no epidurals, just divine chanting and whatever herbs you could smuggle past the priest. You can almost hear the advice, "Breathe, my queen," and pass the oil. Even the nobility joined in. Pharaohs loved their luxury, and cannabis ointments were applied to relieve royal migraines, possibly caused by the crushing weight of the crown or the endless meetings about pyramid deadlines. In short, the Egyptians didn't just build monuments, they built coping mechanisms. Cannabis wasn't a rebellion, it was a survival tool. When your gods demand perfection, your climate demands sweat, and your workers keep collapsing in the sun, a little green plant starts to look like divine intervention. By the time cannabis reached ancient Greece, the locals had already perfected two national pastimes: arguing and drinking. Naturally, a plant that encouraged both introspection and mild chaos fit right in. The Greeks didn't invent cannabis use. They just intellectualized it, as they did with everything. To them, nothing was sacred until it had been debated, categorized, and turned into a symposium topic. And so began the philosophical relationship between weed and wisdom, or, as Plato might have called it, the Republic of Chill. Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Dioscorides wrote about cannabis in their medical texts, praising its ability to treat inflammation, earaches, and pain of the inner self, which might be the first recorded diagnosis of existential dread. They weren't exactly rolling joints under the Acropolis, but it's safe to say the stuff was around, and probably discussed in that overly serious tone that made everything sound profound. Imagine a symposium, a smoky hall, cups of wine, a half-dozen philosophers reclining on couches, and someone casually mentioning, "My friends, what if reality is an illusion?" Cue nodding, debate, and someone coughing in the corner because they took a little too much medicinal incense. The Greeks didn't see cannabis as scandalous. They saw it as natural. It grew in the wild, cured ailments, and occasionally caused the kind of clarity that ruins friendships. Soldiers used hemp to heal wounds, while thinkers likely used it to wound logic. Everyone had their angle. Even Herodotus, the travel blogger of the ancient world, wrote about the Scythians and their joyous vapours. The Greeks admired it, of course, but pretended to be above such behaviour. You know the way modern people admire yoga retreats but never go. It's not that Greek philosophers needed weed to think deeply. They already questioned everything: gods, laws, morality, and why sandals hurt so much. Cannabis just helped make those questions feel even more important. So while Athens debated the meaning of virtue somewhere in a quiet garden, a lesser-known philosopher probably stared at an olive tree for 2 hours and whispered, "I think it understands me." And honestly, that's the most Greek thing that's ever happened. When the Roman Empire wasn't conquering people, it was busy conquering their stuff: food, gods, languages, and, naturally, cannabis. The plant crept into Rome quietly, hitching a ride on trade routes and never leaving. The Romans didn't worship it like the Indians, or philosophize about it like the Greeks. They just used it, complained about it, and wrote manuals on it. To a Roman, cannabis was practical. They used its fibers to make ropes, sails, and tents, essential gear for an empire that couldn't stop invading places. Hemp ropes hauled ships across the Mediterranean, tied prisoners, and occasionally doubled as laundry lines for togas soaked in regret. If Rome had a motto, it might have been Veni, Vidi, Vaped. Doctors loved it too. The famed physician Dioscorides, yes, the same Greek guy, Rome borrowed him like they borrowed everything, recommended cannabis for earaches, gout, and pain of the joints, which, to be fair, was probably half the population after years of marching, fighting, and public orgies. It also supposedly reduced sexual desire, the kind of prescription that instantly made it unpopular with the Senate. Meanwhile, Roman women used cannabis-infused oils for beauty treatments, claiming it softened the skin and eased female complaints. Given the quality of Roman plumbing and diet, that's probably the nicest thing their bodies experienced all year. But don't imagine marble statue stoners lounging around the forum. For Romans, intoxication was a moral issue. Wine was civilized. Hashish? Suspicious. Anything that made you too happy without taxation was a problem. So while hemp was everywhere, actually smoking, it was reserved for foreigners, mystics, and that one uncle who never shut up about the stars. Still, it spread through the empire like gossip at a bathhouse. Roman soldiers carried hemp seeds to distant provinces, unknowingly turning half of Europe into potential farmland for the world's most versatile weed. From Britain to North Africa, cannabis took root, quietly, stubbornly, like every idea Rome tried to suppress. So while emperors toasted with wine and philosophers debated virtue, humble hemp was holding the empire together. literally. Sails, scrolls, ropes, and remedies, all courtesy of a plant no one wanted to admit they secretly respected. Rome may have fallen, but cannabis didn't. It simply waited, patient and green, for the next empire to take credit for discovering it. By the time the Silk Road hit its golden age, cannabis had achieved something every empire dreamed of: total globalization without a single battle. No armies, no conquests, just chill merchants spreading good vibes and better hemp. Picture it: a caravan winding through the deserts of Central Asia, camels groaning, traders sweating, spices perfuming the air, and somewhere in the back, a sack of cannabis seeds labelled "for medicinal purposes." It was the ancient world's version of a carry-on excuse. Along these routes, the plant became a shapeshifter. In China, it was medicine and paper. In India, it was sacred. In Persia, it was wisdom in smoke form. And by the time it reached the Middle East and Africa, it was hashish, portable, potent, and infinitely more fun than religion allowed. Merchants didn't just sell silk and spices, they sold culture. Every trade stop became a swap meet for ideas, stories, and the occasional cloud of aromatic smoke. You could hear Sanskrit hymns blending with Persian poetry, while someone in the corner accidentally invented hotboxing again. The assassins of Alamut, a secretive sect of hashish users in Persia, gained fame along the route. According to chroniclers, mostly biased, nervous Europeans, they smoked hashish before carrying out political assassinations. The truth is murkier. They probably just enjoyed the stuff and were good at stabbing. Still, the legend stuck, and hashashin eventually morphed into our modern word, assassin. A linguistic masterpiece born from paranoia and bad PR. Further west, Arab physicians explored cannabis in medical texts, calling it both a cure for melancholy and a threat to discipline, which, frankly, still describes it perfectly. As for the traders themselves, they discovered an essential truth of business. People will always pay extra for anything that makes them forget they're on a camel for 9 months. The Silk Road turned cannabis into the first truly multicultural plant. It crossed languages, religions, and moral codes, and everyone pretended they were only using it for healing. Whether you were a monk in China, a merchant in Samarkand, or a mystic in Cairo, the smell was the same: smoke, dust, and mild enlightenment. Cannabis had gone viral, and there was no logging off. By the time the Islamic Golden Age rolled around, cannabis had become the polite guest nobody admitted to inviting, but everyone let stay. From Baghdad to Cairo, it wafted quietly through mosques, palaces, and poetry circles, never mentioned too loudly, but always there. The early Islamic world was a cultural powerhouse: algebra, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and a plant that made all of those things just a little more interesting. Scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi wrote about cannabis in their medical works, describing it as useful for pain, digestion, and calming of the spirit, which is medieval code for take one and stop arguing about theology for 5 minutes. But Islam had a complicated relationship with intoxication. The Quran forbade alcohol, fair enough, but didn't say much about weed. That left room for interpretation, and wherever interpretation exists, humans immediately find a loophole. Thus, the rise of hashish, the original grey area of divine law. The Sufi mystics embraced it fully. These were the spiritual poets and dancers of Islam, the ones spinning in circles and claiming union with God through music, prayer, and occasionally substances that made God seem unusually chatty. For Sufis, cannabis wasn't a vice, it was a bridge. A fragrant, slightly giggly bridge to the divine. Meanwhile, the religious establishment frowned. Hashish dens popped up from Egypt to Persia, filled with scholars, merchants, and people who were definitely supposed to be somewhere else. Authorities called it a moral plague. Preachers condemned it as the herb of idleness. And yet every crackdown failed, mostly because the enforcers also needed to confiscate large amounts of evidence for personal testing. By the 13th century, hashish had become the era's open secret. Poets praised it, rulers banned it, doctors prescribed it, and beggars smoked it. Everyone had an opinion, and half of them forgot what it was mid-sentence. So while Europe was busy burning witches and bathing occasionally, the Islamic world was debating whether cannabis brought you closer to God or just closer to a nap. Either way, the result was the same, a civilization at the peak of its creativity, and possibly a little high while getting there. Somewhere in the tangled mountains of 11th century Persia, cannabis got its first real PR problem. The legend begins with a secretive sect called the Nizari Ismailis, who built fortified castles, annoyed empires, and occasionally removed political rivals in creative ways. Their leader, Hassani Saba, ruled from a mountain fortress called Alamut, a name that roughly translates to Eagle's Nest, because murder headquarters didn't test well with the neighbours. According to medieval rumour, his followers, the Hashashin, smoked hashish before carrying out assassinations, moving in a blissful haze of divine purpose. Chroniclers swore that the drug made them fearless, devoted, and very stabby. It's an exciting story, and almost certainly nonsense. In reality, there's no evidence these men ever used hashish before missions. The myth was probably cooked up by their enemies, who needed a good excuse for why an elite team of mountain zealots kept outsmarting entire empires. Blaming the drugs was easier than admitting the other side just had better planning. "They're not geniuses, they're high" became the medieval version of damage control, but the story spread faster than a rumour at a crusader camp. European knights returned home whispering tales of Eastern killers intoxicated by strange herbs. The word Hashashin mutated through languages until it became assassin. And just like that, a religion, a tactic, and a drug fused into one sensational headline that lasted 900 years. Ironically, the Nizari Ismailis were scholars, engineers, and diplomats more than anything else. They built libraries, negotiated treaties, and only killed people when absolutely necessary, which admittedly was still quite often. The idea that they got high before missions probably came from the same chroniclers who believed dragons lived in Ethiopia. Still, the damage was done. Hashish was forever linked with shadowy violence, even though the real connection was medieval gossip and a chronic lack of fact-checking. So next time someone says, assassin, remember, it started as an overblown rumour about a group of bookish Persians who may or may not have enjoyed herbal incense. The myth survived, the castles fell, and cannabis gained a new reputation, from sacred plant to suspicious substance. And humanity, as usual, learned absolutely nothing from it. By the time cannabis drifted into medieval Europe, the continent had already developed a refined system for handling new ideas. Fear them, ban them, then quietly use them anyway. Hemp had been around for centuries as rope, oil, and fabric. No one thought twice about it. But the moment someone decided to light it up instead of spin it, the church got involved. To be fair, medieval Europe wasn't exactly in a mood for experimentation. Between crusades, famines, and the occasional plague wiping out a third of the population, people were barely holding it together. The church controlled everything: law, medicine, and your odds of eternal happiness. And it wasn't thrilled about substances that made peasants giggle during sermons. Still, cannabis slipped through the cracks. Monks grew hemp in monastery gardens to make parchment and prayer ropes, all while writing moral condemnations of sinful herbs. It's safe to assume at least one monk tried the product and had a profound spiritual moment involving a candle flame and 37 Gregorian chants. By the 13th century, doctors and apothecaries were quietly prescribing cannabis oil for pain, fever, and what they delicately called female complaints. It worked, which made it suspicious. Anything that cured suffering without divine intervention raised eyebrows, and usually torches. The church preferred its miracles to come from heaven, not from someone's backyard. Meanwhile, travellers returning from the Crusades brought stories of hashish dens in the east, dark rooms full of relaxed people who weren't killing each other. Naturally, Europe found this horrifying. Chroniclers described Saracens who smoke madness into their souls. Translation: they looked happy, which was clearly evil. Before long, cannabis joined the growing list of things the church disapproved of: pagan rituals, heresy, women reading, and now good moods. Officially, it was labelled a devil's herb. Unofficially, it was still being used by midwives, herbalists, and anyone with chronic back pain and a realistic view of God's priorities. So, Europe managed to take a versatile, harmless plant and turn it into a moral crisis, a skill it still hasn't lost. Hemp stayed legal as long as it behaved, but the moment it hinted at pleasure, it was excommunicated. Thus began Europe's longest-standing tradition, being both terrified of and dependent on the same thing. By the late Middle Ages, cannabis had done what most humans couldn't: survived everything. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, entire civilizations burned. And yet, the same scrappy green plant just kept growing wherever people were stressed and soil existed. Europe used hemp for everything: ropes, sails, paper, and clothing. The age of exploration was basically powered by weed, not the fun kind, but the kind that held up ships. Columbus wouldn't have made it to the New World without hemp rigging, hemp caulking, and probably hemp underwear. So yes, in a way, cannabis accidentally discovered America. Still, its reputation remained divided. To the working class, it was a practical crop. To doctors, it was medicine. To the church, it was one more thing to blame for moral decay. Every group needed it, hated it, or both, which is more or less the story of civilization. By the Renaissance, scientists were dissecting everything from corpses to philosophy, and cannabis quietly snuck back into medicine cabinets. Apothecaries sold it for pain, seizures, and sleeplessness. Poets hinted at it in verse. And while Europe still officially frowned upon pleasure, it had also just invented gin, so judgment was a bit selective. Then came the colonial era, where cannabis sailed across oceans again, this time in every direction. The Spanish planted it in the Americas, the Portuguese took it to Africa, the British industrialized it. Every empire claimed it was introducing a useful agricultural resource, which is history's polite way of saying, we're cashing in. By the 19th century, cannabis had gone from sacred to scandalous to scientific. Victorians used it in tinctures for nerves, sleep, and hysteria, while politely ignoring that half their society was addicted to laudanum. Doctors praised it. Artists painted about it. Then, as always, governments panicked and outlawed it, because nothing frightens authority like people being relaxed. And yet, here we are, thousands of years later, still debating the same plant. A plant that outlived pharaohs, philosophers, popes, and prohibition. It built ships, healed wounds, started myths, and occasionally made people stare at wallpaper for hours. Humanity keeps trying to control cannabis, but somehow it always slips through our fingers. One puff, one poem, one perfectly rolled piece of history at a time. Rome, 1480. A city so drenched in sin that even the angels were rumoured to carry handkerchiefs over their noses. Into this perfumed cesspool of power and corruption was born Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, the man who would later become Pope Alexander VI. From the moment she drew her first breath, Lucrezia wasn't so much a child, as she was a political pawn in human form. Her father, Rodrigo, wasn't known for restraint. He had mistresses, children, enemies, and probably a few people who were both. Her mother, Vanozza dei Catane, was one of his long-time lovers, a Roman widow with ambition and patience, enough to tolerate a man whose moral compass pointed strictly toward personal gain. Together, they produced several children, but Lucrezia was the jewel, intelligent, charming, and suspiciously useful. By the time she could walk, deals were being made in her name. Imagine being 6 years old and already promised to secure an alliance between noble families who'd never even met you. That was Lucrezia's reality. Her early education wasn't about dolls or prayers. It was about rhetoric, diplomacy, and the art of looking harmless while quietly plotting someone's downfall. Still, young Lucrezia was no villain. Not yet. Contemporary accounts describe her as graceful, fair-haired, with the kind of beauty Renaissance poets could write odes about before inevitably being poisoned at dinner. Her tutors taught her Latin, music, and poetry, skills meant to make her the perfect wife, or more accurately, the perfect bargaining chip. The Borgia's name already carried the scent of scandal, and Lucrezia, though innocent at the time, would inherit its perfume. While her father manoeuvred his way to the papal throne through bribes and backroom deals, the young girl watched and learned. She saw that in Rome, virtue was decorative, and survival required flexibility, moral, political, and occasionally anatomical. By the time Rodrigo became pope, the Vatican turned into a family business. Cardinals whispered, rivals schemed, and everyone assumed the Borgia's blonde daughter must be in on the corruption. Whether she was a serpent in silk or merely a dove raised in a nest of vipers would become one of history's favourite debates. When Rodrigo Borgia officially became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, the Vatican didn't just gain a spiritual leader, it gained a family business. The Holy See, once a fortress of piety, or at least good PR, was now an extension of the Borgia household. And like any good Italian dynasty, business meant marriage, money, and manipulation, three areas in which young Lucrezia would soon excel, whether she wanted to or not. At 12 years old, Lucrezia was already being traded across Europe's noble families like a particularly elegant chess piece. Her first engagement was to a Spanish nobleman, Don Cherubino Juan de Centelles, but that alliance fell through faster than a papal promise of reform. Her second fiancé, a noble from Naples, suffered a similar fate once his usefulness expired. You could say Lucrezia's love life was less about romance and more about diplomacy with jewellery. By 14, her father arranged her marriage to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a man twice her age and half as cunning. The union was purely strategic, cementing ties between the papal throne and one of Italy's most powerful families. The wedding, of course, was a lavish affair. Rome's nobility dined beneath frescoed ceilings, toasted with golden goblets, and politely ignored the fact that the Pope's daughter was now a walking political treaty. Behind the smiles and lace, Lucrezia played her role flawlessly. She was charming, well-mannered, and spoke like an angel. Unfortunately, angels didn't last long in Vatican politics. Her husband soon found himself out of favour when the Borgias shifted alliances, and when the Borgias shifted, it usually meant someone was about to vanish, resign, or fall ill. Giovanni Sforza didn't wait for divine intervention. He fled Rome, accusing the Pope and Lucrezia of an affair. Yes, he actually accused his wife and father-in-law of incest. It was a scandal that made Rome gasp and snicker in equal measure. Lucrezia, barely 16, became the talk of Europe, her name whispered in every court as both victim and temptress. But the Borgias didn't crumble under gossip. They turned it into strategy. The Pope declared her marriage null on grounds of non-consummation, which must have been awkward for everyone involved. Giovanni was humiliated, Lucrezia was free, and the game of alliances continued. After her first marriage was neatly erased from history by papal decree, Lucrezia didn't have long to rest. Her father, ever the multitasker, had a new plan, and it came wrapped in Neapolitan silk. Her next groom would be Alfonso of Aragon, a handsome young prince and the illegitimate son of the King of Naples. The match promised stability for the Papal States, and more importantly, a useful alliance in the endless Italian power shuffle. Lucrezia, now 17, seemed genuinely happy for once. Alfonso was close to her age, reportedly kind and easy on the eyes, a refreshing change after Giovanni Sforza, whose only talent had been paranoia. The pair had a son, Rodrigo, named after her father, because who doesn't want to remind everyone of the family brand at every possible occasion? For a brief and shining moment, the Borgias looked almost respectable, but respectability doesn't sell in Renaissance Rome. Political winds shifted faster than morality, and soon the alliance with Naples soured. Her brother Cesare Borgia, charming, brilliant, and occasionally homicidal, decided that Alfonso was suddenly inconvenient, In Borgia speak, that meant doomed. One summer evening in 1500, assassins attacked Alfonso on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He survived the first attempt, a miracle really. But while recovering in his chambers, someone strangled him. Eyewitnesses claimed Cesare's men did it. Others whispered that Lucrezia herself had held the pillow. The truth, as with most Borgia stories, was probably somewhere between horror and rumour. Lucrezia reportedly wept bitterly, and it's hard to say whether her tears were for love lost or power slipping away. The Vatican spun a tale of bandits, but no one believed it. Rome's gossip mills ran hot. The Pope's daughter, the poisoner, the Black Widow of the Tiber. Whether or not she was guilty, her reputation was sealed tighter than a confessional door. Yet, rather than collapse, Lucrezia adapted. She learned the fine art of appearing fragile while quietly surviving everyone who crossed her. She retreated to convents for reflection, or, as cynics claimed, to wait out public outrage. By 18, she had already been married twice, widowed once, and accused of more crimes than most cardinals. But the game wasn't over. The next marriage would not just secure her family's power, it would transform her from papal pawn to duchess. In 1502, at the age of 22, Lucrezia Borgia became the Duchess of Ferrara, and for once, not everyone was horrified. Her marriage to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the powerful Este family, was less a romantic leap and more a desperate political calculation. The Borgias needed respectability after a decade of blood, rumours, and accidental deaths. Ferrara, on the other hand, needed papal favour and a hefty dowry. In short, everyone held their noses and smiled. When Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara, she brought with her wagons of gold, fine fabrics, servants, musicians, and a reputation so toxic it could wilt the city's roses. The Este court, renowned for its refinement, didn't know what to make of her. Courtiers whispered that she carried poison in her rings, that her perfume was laced with arsenic, and that kissing her hand might be fatal. One poet even wrote that her smile contained both heaven and hell. He wasn't wrong, it was Renaissance Italy after all. But to their surprise, Lucrezia didn't come to destroy Ferrara. She came to rebuild herself. Instead of scandal, she offered culture. She turned the court into a glittering centre of art and music, hosting poets, scholars, and philosophers. Even Niccolò Machiavelli, who wasn't easily impressed, spoke of her political grace. For a woman whose name had become a curse, Lucrezia's reinvention bordered on miraculous. Her marriage to Alfonso wasn't particularly affectionate. He was more interested in cannons than conversation, but it was stable. He valued her intellect and trusted her to manage affairs while he was away. She became the duchy's unofficial diplomat, negotiating between feuding powers and writing letters that dripped with tact and charm. Still, ghosts from Rome lingered. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, died in 1503, supposedly after a bad batch of poisoned wine meant for someone else. Cesare Borgia's empire crumbled soon after. Overnight, the Borgia name went from untouchable to unmentionable. Lucrezia, ever pragmatic, quietly distanced herself from her infamous past. In Ferrara, she was no longer the Pope's daughter or the alleged poisoner. She was the Duchess, elegant, composed, and determined to outlive the legends that haunted her. And for a time, she succeeded. The serpent of Rome had shed her skin, and what emerged was a woman of astonishing poise. But peace, in her world, never lasted long. By the time the ink dried on her Ferrara marriage papers, Lucrezia's world had already begun to unravel. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, died in 1503, and the circumstances of his death were pure Borgia irony. The story goes that he and Cesare accidentally drank poisoned wine intended for someone else. Whether divine justice or poor labelling, the result was the same. The mighty patriarch was gone, and the family's web of influence began to dissolve faster than holy water on a hot brazier. For Lucrezia, it was both freedom and disaster. Without her father's protection, the Vatican turned on the Borgias like wolves, Her brother Cesare, the family's brutal enforcer, lost everything: his lands, his armies, his political leverage. Captured, imprisoned, and eventually killed in Spain, he became a tragic echo of his former self. The man who once made princes tremble now bled out on a roadside at 31. The fall of the Borgias left Lucrezia stranded in a sea of enemies. In Rome, her name was synonymous with sin. In Ferrara, it was still a polite scandal. The courtiers whispered about her family's downfall, the poisonings, the incest, all the familiar bedtime stories of the Renaissance. Yet she didn't flinch. If anything, she became quieter, colder, more calculating. In Letters to Allies, Lucrezia wrote with a tone of melancholy grace, describing herself as a woman of misfortune. It was a careful choice of words. She never denied her past. She simply outlived it. While her relatives were stripped of titles and chased from cities, she remained securely in Ferrara, navigating the political ruins like a survivor of a shipwreck who found herself standing on an island of gold. Her husband Alfonso, initially wary of his infamous bride, began to rely on her more. She handled correspondence, managed estates, and entertained ambassadors with a level of refinement that made her indispensable. The Duchess of Ferrara might have been born in scandal, but she had mastered the art of endurance. Still, there was an invisible shadow in her chambers, the knowledge that her family's name would never be cleansed. Rome had fallen silent about the Borgias, but silence, as Lucrezia knew, was rarely innocent. It was the kind of silence people use when they're waiting for the next rumour to be true. By the early 1510s, Lucrezia Borgia had completed the most improbable transformation in Renaissance Italy, from the Vatican's scandalous daughter to one of its most admired duchesses. Her court in Ferrara became a sanctuary for poets, painters, and philosophers, a sort of cultural rehab centre, where tortured geniuses could complain about the Pope over good wine. Under her patronage, Ferrara blossomed into a jewel of the Italian Renaissance. She sponsored writers like Ludovico Ariosto, whose Orlando Furioso would become a literary masterpiece. Musicians such as Josquin des Prez and Antonio de Cabezon performed at her court, filling the ducal palace with sacred hymns and suspiciously secular ballads. The Duchess herself played the lute, wrote poetry, and hosted salons that made Florence's Medici circles look downright provincial. What made Lucrezia remarkable wasn't just her taste, it was her subtle power. While Alfonso obsessed over fortifications and artillery, the man could talk about cannon calibers for hours, she handled diplomacy with velvet gloves. Ambassadors from France, Spain, and Venice wrote of her intelligence and charm, often adding, with thinly veiled awe, that she seemed nothing like her family. Still, whispers followed her everywhere. Visitors would glance around the grand halls of Ferrara, admire the frescoes, sip her wine, and then quietly ask whether she still kept a vial of poison among her perfumes. The Renaissance loved nothing more than redemption wrapped in suspicion. Privately, Lucrezia's life was less glamorous. She bore several children, endured miscarriages, and faced the cold practicality of a husband more soldier than lover. Yet she never allowed tragedy to define her. In letters, she spoke of faith, music, and the peace of the soul, words that sounded less like confession and more like self-preservation. Her relationship with the church remained complicated. She funded monasteries and charities, perhaps out of guilt, or perhaps because in Italy, salvation was just another investment. She even befriended reform-minded clerics, though always with careful distance. After all, when your family once ran the papacy like a crime syndicate, you don't get to preach about holiness. In Ferrara, Lucrezia had built what Rome had denied her, legitimacy. But the Renaissance had a cruel sense of timing, and even duchesses who escaped their pasts could not escape mortality. By 1512, Lucrezia Borgia's carefully rebuilt life began to crack beneath the weight of grief. Her elegant Ferrara court, once alive with laughter, poetry, and debate, turned sombre. The woman whom Europe had once painted as a temptress was now defined by loss. Her son Rodrigo, the child she had with Alfonso of Aragon years before, died suddenly at just 12 years old. The boy had been living in Naples, far from his mother's reach, and the news hit her like a dagger dipped in memory. Letters from the time describe her anguish in chilling detail. "I'm left with no comfort," she wrote to a confidant, "except the prayers I whisper at dawn." The tone wasn't political, it was human. For a woman accused of every sin under the sun, she suddenly appeared almost saintly in her sorrow. But fate wasn't finished twisting the knife. 2 more of her children died in infancy, and her health began to fail. Some said it was heartbreak, others whispered poison. Old habits die hard. But the truth was simpler. Years of childbirth, stress, and the Renaissance's poor medical hygiene had taken their toll. Yet, even as tragedy closed in, Lucrezia's dignity only deepened. She turned increasingly toward religion, not in the fire and brimstone way of her papal father, but with a quiet, personal devotion. She corresponded with monks, gave generous donations to convents, and spent long hours in prayer. The court chroniclers, those same men who once called her the Viper of Rome, began to refer to her as the Christian Duchess. Her husband Alfonso, a man more comfortable with cannons than condolences, reportedly grew to admire her resilience. He even began to rely on her judgment again, though she was often ill and withdrawn. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman once accused of scheming through poison and lust now represented piety and composure. To outsiders, it looked like redemption. To Lucrezia, perhaps, it felt more like exhaustion. The games of politics, the deaths, the whispers, all of it had burned through her spirit. But she wasn't done yet. Her final years would prove that even in frailty, she could still command the stage. And this time, there would be no need for masks or intrigue, just a quiet reckoning with the legend she had become. By 1518, Lucrezia Borgia was no longer the glittering duchess who had once enchanted Ferrara's salons. She had become something quieter, softer, yet still magnetic. The gossip mongers of Rome had moved on to new scandals, and in their silence, Lucrezia found peace. Her days revolved around her children, her faith, and the daily rituals of a court that no longer required her to prove herself. Her eldest surviving son, Ercole, was being groomed as the next Duke of Ferrara. She adored him, writing letters filled with gentle advice and a touch of fatalism, as though she knew time was short. Her husband, Alfonso, still occupied himself with politics and fortifications, but their marriage had settled into a kind of quiet partnership. Whatever love once flickered between them had evolved into something sturdier, mutual respect, or perhaps shared endurance. Still, there were shadows. Lucrezia's health, already fragile from years of childbirth and stress, worsened. Chronic fevers, exhaustion, and fainting spells left her bedridden for days. But in true Borgia fashion, she refused to let illness strip her of grace. Visitors described her as serene, almost luminous, even as her body failed her. In June of 1519, she went into labour once more, her 10th pregnancy. The child, a girl, was stillborn. Complications followed, and infection set in. Renaissance medicine being what it was, mostly herbs, prayers, and wishful thinking, there was little to be done. As the fever worsened, Lucrezia asked for confession, received the sacraments, and requested to be left alone with her chaplain. Accounts from those final days describe her as calm, accepting, and resolute, the opposite of the woman painted in pamphlets as the Vatican's seductress. On June 24, 1519, Lucrezia Borgia died at the age of 39. Her last words reportedly were a prayer for her children and for the peace of those who wronged me. Ferrara mourned sincerely. Poets wept, courtiers spoke of her kindness, and even those who had doubted her grace admitted she had died as a true Christian lady. The duchy buried her in the convent of Corpus Domini, a quiet sanctuary that suited her better than any gilded palace. In death, she achieved what she had been denied in life. Silence, not the silence of rumour, but the peace of finally being left alone. Death didn't end Lucrezia Borgia's story. It made it immortal. Within months of her passing, the pamphlets, poems, and chronicles of Europe went to work, reshaping her life into myth. To some, she was the perfect Renaissance monster, the Pope's daughter who dabbled in poison, lust, and intrigue. To others, she was the innocent pawn, a woman trapped in a web spun by men far more ruthless than she. The truth, as always with the Borgias, was both and neither. Writers of later centuries adored her contradictions. Victor Hugo painted her as the deadly femme fatale of his 1833 play Lucrezia Borgia. Donizetti turned that same myth into an opera, letting her voice soar through arias of guilt and vengeance. Painters portrayed her with golden hair and cold eyes, one hand clutching a goblet, the other resting on a skull, half Madonna, half executioner. Even Machiavelli, who had met her brother Cesare, hinted that her political finesse made her as formidable as any prince. Yet those who read her surviving letters found something different. A woman who spoke tenderly of her children, who worried about convent accounts, who prayed daily, and who signed her name, "Your most devoted Lucrezia." There was no venom, no seduction, only intelligence and melancholy. Her legend survived because she embodied the Renaissance contradiction itself. Beauty and corruption, grace and ambition, sanctity and sin. She lived in an age where men poisoned cities and called it diplomacy. But because she was a woman, her every smile became suspicion. The same world that forgave popes for murder never forgave Lucrezia for surviving it. Centuries later, historians began to reclaim her humanity. Modern scholarship sees her not as the she-devil of Rome, but as a political survivor born into an impossible family. She played her role because she had no choice, and played it well enough to leave a legacy that still captures imaginations 500 years later. In the end, Lucrezia Borgia became exactly what history loves most, a riddle with perfect handwriting. Whether she was saint or serpent depends on who tells the tale. But one thing is certain. Few women ever danced so gracefully on the knife's edge between damnation and immortality. And even in death, the world kept whispering her name. At the heart of ancient Rome, between the Aventine and Palatine hills, stood a monument to chaos and glory, the Circus Maximus. It wasn't just an arena. It was Rome's beating heart, pulsing with dust, danger, and divine madness. On race days, half the city poured in. Over 200,000 people packed shoulder to shoulder, shouting, sweating, and praying that their favourite team wouldn't crash before the first turn. From a distance, the circus looked like a sun-bleached colossus, stretching nearly 600 metres long. Inside, it was pure frenzy. Senators reclined under silk awnings, their rings glittering in the light. Commoners cheered from the stone terraces, waving scraps of coloured cloth, red, blue, green, or white, the banners of their beloved racing factions. Even the emperor himself would lean forward when the signal dropped. As eager as the butcher or baker seated below, trumpets blared. The charioteers, young men with more courage than sense, tightened their reins and whispered prayers to Fortuna, goddess of luck. Horses stamped and snorted, their bronze fittings glinting under the sun. Then, with a blast of the mapper, the white starting cloth, the race erupted. 12 teams thundered forward, wheels clattering, sand exploding under hooves. The noise was so loud it made the marble quake, the air filled with the smell of sweat, leather, and burnt oil. In a heartbeat, the crowd was possessed, shouting names, cursing rivals, clutching bets. And the danger was no illusion. One wrong turn at the spina, the central divider, and a charioteer could be flung into the stands, or crushed beneath his own horses. Death came fast in the circus, but so did fame. A victorious driver could earn the adoration of thousands, his name sung in taverns for weeks. To Romans, the circus wasn't just entertainment, it was religion in motion. Each race felt like a prayer, each crash like divine punishment. It was where gods and gamblers met, where emperors courted popularity, and where the poorest slave could feel, if only for a moment, the thrill of command. And as the dust settled, one truth echoed through the roaring arena. Rome lived for the race, and sometimes it died for it. If the Circus Maximus was Rome's heart, its pulse was divided into 4 colours: red, blue, green, and white. These were more than racing teams. They were tribal identities, political loyalties, and emotional addictions rolled into one. Every Roman belonged to a faction, whether born into nobility or scraping by as a beggar. To wear a team's colour wasn't fashion, it was faith. The Reds were hot-tempered, fiery, and loved by the working classes. The Whites carried the aura of old money and tradition. The Greens, backed by merchants and the rising middle class, were known for their cunning and their willingness to bribe officials to adjust results. The Blues, perhaps the most infamous, counted senators and emperors among their patrons. They represented the elite, the disciplined, the untouchable. These factions weren't just names shouted at races, they were full-blown corporations. Each had stables, trainers, financiers, priests, and spies. They bought the best horses from Spain and North Africa, trained their drivers like warriors, and maintained networks so vast they could rival military intelligence. Some factions even owned slaves who specialized in cheering, professional fans whose only job was to scream louder than the opposition. Fights between supporters were as common as the races themselves. Streets erupted into riots when a favourite charioteer lost unfairly, or a rival's driver was accused of sabotage. Imagine modern soccer hooliganism, but with swords and torches. Emperor Nero once tried to calm the chaos by supporting both the Greens and Blues, but instead of peace, it made things worse. Everyone wanted imperial favouritism, and no one wanted to share it. For the fans, victory wasn't just about winning, it was about identity. If your faction triumphed, you walked home taller. If it lost, you drowned your shame in cheap wine and vowed revenge next time. Children were baptised in team colours. Wives left husbands who supported rival factions. More than one duel began over whether a driver from the Greens had intentionally clipped a Blues wheel. In the end, the Circus Maximus wasn't just a racetrack. It was Rome's social battlefield. And when the colours clashed, it wasn't horses that collided. It was the soul of the empire itself. To the roaring crowds of the Circus Maximus, charioteers were nothing short of gods on wheels. They were the rock stars of ancient Rome, adored, envied, and often dead before 30. Their names echoed through taverns and markets: Scorpus, Diocles, Porphyrius, men who could turn a lap around the spina into a small eternity of glory. But behind the glamour was grit. Most charioteers weren't born noble. They were slaves, bought and trained by the racing factions from a young age. The lucky few earned freedom through victories. The luckier ones lived long enough to spend it. Training began in the stables, where boys learned to harness 4 horses at once. 2 tons of muscle, chaos, and divine temperament. The reins were wrapped around their waists, so if they fell, the horses dragged them until the ground stopped them, or didn't. Each chariot was a lightweight death trap of wood and leather, built for speed, not safety. Drivers leaned forward, knees bent, whipping their horses while watching for rivals trying to cut them off at the turning posts. The trick was balance: lean too far, and you flipped; too slow, and you were crushed from behind. One race could turn a nameless slave into a celebrity, or into a stain on the track. Still, the rewards were irresistible. A successful charioteer could earn tens of thousands of sesterces per season, fortunes that rivaled senators. The legendary Gaius Apuleius Diocles retired after 24 years of racing with a fortune equivalent to hundreds of millions today. He could have bought a city. And yet, even he admitted that every victory came with a price. Bones broken, horses killed, friends lost. The fans loved them obsessively. They painted portraits of their favourite drivers on walls, wore miniature charms in their likeness, and shouted prayers for their safety. Some even left offerings at shrines to ensure their idol's success: hair, coins, or, in true Roman fashion, curses against rival racers. The charioteers knew the truth. They weren't just athletes, they were gladiators on wheels. Every race was a battle disguised as sport, and every lap a flirtation with death. And in a city that worshipped spectacle, dying dramatically was almost as good as winning. When the signal dropped and the mapper fell from the magistrate's hand, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The gates burst open, and 12 chariots lunged forward like unleashed beasts. The roar of the crowd hit like thunder. For the next 7 laps, roughly 5 miles, the Circus Maximus became a storm of speed, dust, and danger. The track, lined with gleaming sand, circled the spina, a central divider decorated with statues, shrines, and the famous obelisks stolen from Egypt. These sacred markers gave the race a sense of divine theatre, men battling for glory beneath the gaze of gods. But nobody was thinking about Apollo or Neptune when the wheels started rattling. They were thinking about survival. Charioteers leaned low, the reins wrapped around their bodies for control, the whip flicking with deadly precision. The 4 horses, a team called a quadriga, had to move as one organism, each responding to the driver's slightest twitch. The outside horse set the speed, the inside one, the angle of the turn. If even one faltered, the entire chariot could shatter like pottery. The most dangerous part of the race was the meti, the turning posts at either end of the spina. Here, men gambled their lives for inches. A skilled driver hugged the post so close that his wheel might scrape stone. A careless one clipped it and went flying. Crashes, called naufragia, shipwrecks, were the crowd's favourite spectacle. Horses screamed, wood splintered, and bodies were flung into chaos. The crowd howled with bloodthirsty glee. Women fainted, gamblers tore their tunics, emperors leaned forward in fascination. Even when a charioteer fell, the race didn't stop. The next driver simply steered around the wreckage, sometimes using fallen rivals as obstacles to block the competition. Each lap was marked by the turning of bronze dolphins or eggs mounted along the spina. Simple counters, but they drove the tension to fever pitch. 6 dolphins down, 1 to go. The crowd screamed itself hoarse, and when a driver crossed the finish line, dust-caked and trembling, the noise could shake the heavens. It wasn't about horses or skill anymore. It was about Rome itself, reckless, magnificent, and utterly addicted to the roar of victory. Beneath the thunder of hooves and cheers, another war raged. One fought with coins, curses, and pure obsession. Betting at the Circus Maximus wasn't a side hobby. It was Rome's unofficial religion. Senators, soldiers, and slaves all gambled on the races, united by one universal truth. Fortune favoured no one for long. Bookmakers prowled the stands with wax tablets, taking wagers on everything. The winning colour, the number of crashes, even whether a favourite's horse would make it past the first turn. Spectators handed over coins like offerings to the gods, whispering their hopes to Fortuna, the goddess of chance. For many, she was more reliable than Jupiter himself. The sums were staggering. Wealthy patricians bet entire estates on a single race, while poor labourers staked their week's pay hoping to strike it rich. Some won fortunes overnight. Others ended the day half naked, having sold their cloaks to pay debts. It wasn't uncommon for a gambler to hurl himself from the stands after a crushing loss, a dramatic exit the Romans almost admired. The charioteers themselves were part of the gamble. Factions bribed stable hands for inside information, whether a horse was sick, a driver injured, or a wheel sabotaged. Rumours spread faster than wildfire, and the odds changed with every whisper. Rome, ever the empire of spectacle, turned even deceit into entertainment. But betting wasn't just about money. It was tribal warfare disguised as sport. Faction supporters fought in the streets after bad races, blaming corruption, divine injustice, or sheer bad luck. During one infamous riot, fans of the Greens and Blues set parts of the city ablaze, because apparently, sportsmanship was not a Roman virtue. Even emperors couldn't resist the fever. Caligula reportedly bet enormous sums on his beloved green faction, and once threatened to execute a charioteer who lost him a race. Nero, never to be outdone, entered as a driver himself. and of course declared victory even after falling out of the chariot. At the Circus Maximus, money flowed like blood, and both were spilled freely. The crowd didn't just watch the races, they lived them, bled for them, and sometimes died because of them. For Rome, it wasn't gambling. It was destiny, just with worse odds. In the age before marble statues and imperial cults stole the spotlight, charioteers were the true celebrities of Rome. These men, lean, sunburned, and usually one crash away from oblivion, wielded fame greater than generals. Their portraits hung in taverns, their names were carved into walls, and their fans screamed louder than the legions. Gaius Apuleius Diocles became the Michael Jordan of the Circus Maximus. He raced for 24 years, switching factions like modern athletes switch teams for better contracts. By the end of his career, he'd won nearly 1,500 races and earned a fortune so immense that he could have fed all of Rome for a year, or at least thrown the most expensive dinner party in history. Then there was Scorpus, the golden boy of the greens, young, dashing, and almost too fast for his own good. He won 2,000 races before dying in a crash at just 26. The crowd wept, as though Jupiter himself had fallen from the sky. His tombstone still reads, "I carried off the victory palm 1,000 times, but I was cheated of my youth." These men weren't noble, but the Romans didn't care. The public adored them because they defied everything Rome's rigid society stood for. A slave could rise higher than a senator if he could handle the reins. Freedmen, foreigners, even those born into poverty became idols through sheer daring. It was the most democratic form of worship the empire ever knew, and with fame came indulgence. Successful drivers lived like kings, expensive villas, servants, lovers, and more wine than a Bacchic feast. The factions guarded them like prized war horses, offering bribes, bodyguards, and sometimes poison to keep rivals away. There were fan clubs, groupies, and jealous street gangs. When a driver changed teams, riots could erupt, as if Julius Caesar himself had switched sides mid-battle. They were adored and hated in equal measure, praised for their skill, cursed for their arrogance, immortalized in mosaics and graffiti. For Rome's masses, these men embodied everything thrilling and terrible about their world: glory, danger, and the promise that anyone, no matter how low born, could touch immortality. In a city of emperors, it was the charioteers who made the people truly roar. To the untrained eye, the Circus Maximus looked like a racetrack. To anyone who lived in Rome, it was the most powerful political arena in the empire. The roar of the crowd wasn't just about horses, it was about loyalty, ideology, and control. Emperors knew this all too well. A happy mob was a quiet mob, and the fastest way to keep them quiet was with bread and circuses, panem et circenses. Politicians sponsored races to buy favour. The bigger the games, the more generous the host appeared. New emperors often opened their reign with extravagant races, showering coins into the stands as if sprinkling holy water. The crowd roared not only for speed, but for gratitude. Temporary, fleeting, but enough to keep daggers out of imperial backs. The factions themselves were miniature political parties, each with its own patrons in the Senate and the palace. The Blues often represented the conservative elite, the establishment class, the kind who toasted Jupiter before raising taxes. The Greens drew support from merchants and the working poor, always restless, always louder. This rivalry occasionally turned deadly. Faction riots erupted in the streets, tearing apart neighbourhoods and temples alike. Even the emperors took sides. Domitian supported the Greens. Caligula adored the Blues so passionately that he once dined in their stables. Nero, ever the performer, declared himself charioteer of all factions, though conveniently he always won. The crowd knew the races were rigged, but pretending not to notice was part of the fun. The circus became Rome's pressure valve. When taxes rose or grain shipments failed, the mob didn't storm the Senate. They booed the emperor during the races. Those boos mattered. One poorly received spectacle could spark uprisings. Emperor Justinian learned this centuries later in Constantinople, when faction riots at the Hippodrome nearly destroyed the city. Rome had written the manual, others merely copied it. To the emperors, the circus was both blessing and curse, the place where their people's joy could keep them in power or end their rule in an afternoon. Every lap around that track was more than sport. It was a metaphor for Rome itself, swift, brilliant, and always one turn away from disaster. The Circus Maximus was Rome at its most dazzling and at its most brutal. Beneath the cheers and music lay a ritual of destruction. Races were spectacles of life and death, and Romans, ever honest about their appetites, found both equally thrilling. Crashes, or naufragia, shipwrecks, were the soul of the show. They happened so frequently that spectators began to treat them as divine interventions. When a chariot smashed into the spinner, some swore they saw the gods deciding fates. Horses screamed, wheels splintered, and drivers were flung like rag dolls. The lucky ones were trampled instantly. The unlucky were dragged around the track by their own reins until only the horses crossed the line. Yet the crowd cheered louder for death than for victory. The circus wasn't a place for mercy. It was a mirror of Roman values. Discipline, courage, and spectacle mattered more than survival. When a driver crashed, the audience would rise as one, shouting his name, honouring him not as a victim, but as a hero who gave everything to the race. The dead didn't leave quietly. They became legends in dust. The wreckage didn't just stain the sand, it fed the city's hunger. Repair crews swarmed the track between races, dragging away shattered chariots, blood and bones, while musicians played to drown the sound. Moments later, the next race began, and the crowd was ecstatic again, as though the last tragedy had never happened. For all its violence, the circus wasn't chaos. It was controlled madness. The Romans prided themselves on order, even in brutality. Engineers maintained precise timing of laps, priests blessed the spina before each event, and the emperor watched from his gilded box to ensure the gods, and the masses, were appeased. It was this balance of danger and decorum that made the circus immortal. The people didn't just want entertainment, they wanted transcendence, that fleeting sense of being part of something larger, louder, and bloodier than themselves. And when the dust finally settled after the last race, the smell of sweat, wine, and crushed flowers hung over the stands, the scent of Rome's greatest addiction. In victory or in wreckage, the circus always gave the crowd what it needed most, a reason to feel alive. For nearly 1,000 years, the Circus Maximus echoed with thunder, hooves, cheers, and the heartbeat of an empire. But as Rome's glory faded, so too did its greatest spectacle. The end didn't come in one dramatic crash. It came quietly, like a dying ember flickering out in the dust it once ignited. By the 4th century, the old gods had fallen out of favour. Christianity swept through the empire, bringing with it a disdain for pagan bloodlust. Bishops called the races sinful distractions. Yet even then, the people resisted. The circus had become more than religion or ritual. It was tradition, identity, and memory. For generations who had nothing left to worship, the roar of the crowd was the last sound of Rome that still felt divine. But the empire's coffers grew thin, and so did its patience. The massive upkeep of the circus, its horses, drivers, and prizes, became too expensive to maintain. The factions once rich with imperial sponsorship began to crumble. Without steady funding, the stables emptied, the chariots broke down, and the once proud banners of red, blue, green and white faded into silence. The Gothic wars and foreign invasions sealed its fate. The circus, once the pride of the capital, became a battleground, then a dumping ground. Weeds overtook the track where Circus once raced. Statues fell. The obelisks were carted off to decorate papal Rome, as if Christianity wanted to tame the ghost of its pagan past. By the time the Western Empire fell, the great stadium was a ruin, but in memory, it never stopped roaring. For centuries afterward, the people of Rome still told stories of the circus. They imagined the sun glinting off the reins, the crowd rising in unison, the cry of victory slicing through the air. Even in ruin, the shape of the track remained visible, a scar across the city that refused to fade. Today, tourists walk the flattened field where 500,000 once screamed, and the silence feels almost sacred. You can still sense the ghosts, the horses, the dust, the impossible speed, because Rome may have fallen, but the Circus Maximus, that mad, glorious heartbeat of a civilization, never truly stopped running. In the 12th century, France was the stage of Europe's greatest performance, and the French court its most glamorous lie. From the outside it glimmered with chivalry, piety, and elegance. But behind those velvet curtains lay a world of whispered affairs, poisoned loyalties, and dangerous games of love and inheritance. King Louis VII, pious to the point of obsession, dreamed of a holy kingdom governed by virtue. His courtiers, however, dreamed of something far more earthly. Each other's spouses, fortunes, and titles. The court at Paris and later at Poitiers buzzed with poetry and scandal in equal measure. Troubadours sang of courtly love, that polished poetic form of adultery that somehow made cheating sound divine. A knight could pledge his pure devotion to a married lady, and if her husband objected, well, clearly he just didn't understand romance. At the centre of this glittering hypocrisy stood Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, bold, intelligent, and far too alive for the dull religiosity of her husband. She brought with her a southern sensuality that the northern clergy found terrifying. Eleanor's court became a paradise for poets, lovers, and opportunists. There, love was sport, gossip was currency, and fidelity was a matter of creative interpretation. The nobles played their parts well. Behind every gallant bow and polite smile was a calculation, a favour owed, a rumour planted, a letter exchanged at midnight. Marriages were political traps, not unions of affection. One wrong word, one misplaced glance could destroy an entire lineage. The court's moral theatre stretched from the halls of Paris to the great duchies of Champagne and Aquitaine. In these glittering chambers, where minstrels recited verses about unattainable love, real women and men risked their lives to make those verses true. Affairs weren't just acts of passion, they were acts of defiance, a rebellion against arranged marriages and rigid hierarchies. But the 12th century court was a dangerous stage. Behind the lace and Latin poetry, there were spies, priests who confessed secrets to bishops, servants who overheard lovers, and nobles who weaponized rumour as efficiently as any sword. In this kingdom dressed in silk, every kiss was political, and every act of love could be the start of a war. If France had a heartbeat in the 12th century, it pulsed through Eleanor of Aquitaine. Born into one of Europe's wealthiest duchies, she was everything the medieval world pretended women weren't supposed to be. Brilliant, seductive, and dangerously independent. When she married Louis VII of France, the match was supposed to unite piety and power. Instead, it created one of the most combustible pairings in royal history. Louis was devout, cautious, and utterly humorless, the kind of man who would apologize to God before enjoying dinner. Eleanor, by contrast, was raised in Aquitaine, a land of poetry, music, and open flirtation. She found Louis's court stifling, his priests exhausting, and his obsession with confession particularly inconvenient for her ambitions. The Queen's charisma drew poets, knights, and even crusaders into her orbit. She wasn't just a consort, she was the cultural engine of France. But admiration easily turned to rumour. During the Second Crusade, Eleanor accompanied her husband to the Holy Land, and tongues wagged across Europe. Chronicles whispered that she spent more time in the company of her handsome uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, than with her husband. Whether true or not, it was the sort of story that burned reputations faster than torches through parchment. When the royal couple returned to France, the marriage was a corpse wearing a crown. Louis, humiliated and convinced of divine punishment, sought annulment. Eleanor, meanwhile, didn't mourn. She strategized. Within weeks, she secured a marriage to Henry of Anjou, soon to become Henry II of England. It was one of the boldest political moves in medieval history. The woman who had been Queen of France now became Queen of England, and brought half of southwestern France with her. Paris was scandalized. Bishops condemned her immodest haste. Nobles whispered that no woman could change kings so easily without witchcraft. But Eleanor didn't need witchcraft, only intelligence and timing. She had turned personal humiliation into geopolitical triumph. With her departure, the French court lost its brightest flame. But in England, Eleanor's story, and her appetite for intrigue, was just beginning. The scandalous queen had merely changed kingdoms, not her nature. And soon, her influence would shake Europe again. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Henry of Anjou, soon to be Henry II of England, Europe held its breath, and then immediately started gossiping. The union united England, Normandy, and Aquitaine into one vast empire, but it also joined two of the most combustible personalities of the Middle Ages. Henry was brilliant, restless, and explosively temperamental. Eleanor was equally intelligent and twice as proud. Together, they were magnificent and utterly disastrous. At first, their marriage burned bright. Henry admired her wit and experience, and Eleanor enjoyed finally having a husband who wasn't terrified of her. Their court became a theatre of intellect and ambition. Diplomats marvelled at their power. Troubadours sang of their beauty, and enemies trembled at their combined influence. But in a court where words were weapons, affection quickly turned into rivalry. Henry's appetite for control was legendary. He managed his lands, his clergy, his barons, and, disastrously, his wife, as though all were extensions of his crown. Eleanor, accustomed to ruling in her own right as Duchess of Aquitaine, chafed at being reduced to a royal ornament. She retreated to her beloved Poitiers, where she surrounded herself with poets and philosophers. But behind the verses and dances, rebellion brewed. Rumours swirled through both courts. Henry kept mistresses, some noble, some not. Eleanor, wounded but defiant, began corresponding with discontented nobles, and most dangerously, with her sons. Their letters, written in careful code, spoke of honour, inheritance, and justice, polite medieval words for revolt. The turning point came when Henry's relationship with Rosamund Clifford, his longtime mistress, became public. Chroniclers later embroidered the story with jealousy and poison, claiming Eleanor hunted Rosamund through a labyrinth with a dagger in hand. While likely apocryphal, it captured the truth in spirit. Eleanor's humiliation was not something she would forgive. By the time she reached her 50s, the queen who had once charmed Europe now stood at the centre of a family civil war. Her sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and Henry the young king, rose against their father with Eleanor's quiet blessing. In a world ruled by kings, Eleanor's pen had become her sword, and the scandal that began as a domestic quarrel would soon shake the thrones of both England and France. By 1173, the great Angevin Empire, ruled by Henry II and shadowed by Eleanor of Aquitaine, was not so much a family as a battlefield with royal titles. Henry's sons were handsome, ambitious, and fatally aware that their father had no intention of letting them rule anything meaningful. They had the crowns, but he had the keys. The eldest, Henry the young king, had been crowned during his father's lifetime, but was treated more like a decorative heir than a co-ruler. Richard, destined for legend as the Lionheart, seethed in Aquitaine under his mother's influence, while Geoffrey of Brittany schemed with the cunning of a man twice his age. Eleanor, exiled from court and nursing years of humiliation, saw in her sons a chance for vengeance disguised as justice. The rebellion began quietly. Letters, alliances, promises. Eleanor encouraged her sons to rise against their father, framing it as a fight for autonomy rather than revenge. Soon, the French king Louis VII, her former husband, joined the cause, proving that in medieval politics, grudges had excellent memory. France armed the sons, and the empire cracked. Henry, furious and betrayed, crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency. His soldiers tore through Aquitaine, castles loyal to Eleanor fell one by one. When the revolt collapsed, Henry's rage turned homeward. His sons begged forgiveness. Eleanor, however, received none. Captured while trying to flee to her lands, she was imprisoned. A queen turned prisoner by her own husband. For 16 years, Henry kept her under guard, moving her between castles like a dangerous relic. Courtiers whispered that she spent her days writing poetry, her nights planning revenge. Her daughters married into Europe's great courts, her sons continued to rebel, and still she waited. To the outside world, Henry had triumphed. Yet the victory soured. His sons despised him, his allies distrusted him, and his wife, the most brilliant woman in Christendom, became a living symbol of his tyranny. The royal scandal that began as a family argument now consumed half of Europe, and as Henry aged, the bars of Eleanor's prison began to rattle. For nothing in history stays confined forever, least of all a queen with unfinished business. For 16 long years, Eleanor of Aquitaine lived behind stone walls, a queen reduced to rumour. Locked away by Henry II, she was moved from castle to castle under heavy guard. Her crime wasn't treason in the legal sense, it was far more unforgivable. She had defied her husband publicly and brilliantly. In the 12th century, that was rebellion enough. But even in captivity, Eleanor remained a presence. She sent quiet letters through sympathetic servants, maintained contact with her daughters across Europe, and kept her name alive in every courtly whisper. When poets sang of noble ladies wronged by cruel lords, everyone knew who they meant. Henry could cage her body, but not her legend. The king, meanwhile, was slowly devoured by his own dynasty. His favourite son, Henry the young king, died in rebellion, begging his father's forgiveness on his deathbed. Geoffrey of Brittany was trampled to death in a tournament. Only Richard and John remained, one noble, one venomous, and both would betray him in their turn. Henry's pride began to rot from within. His long affair with Rosamund Clifford ended in tragedy when she died, leaving the court heavy with gossip that Eleanor had somehow reached her rival from afar. The labyrinth, the poisoned cup, all myths, but myths born of fear. Even imprisoned, Eleanor's reputation for vengeance haunted him. By 1189, age and exhaustion had stripped Henry of the fire that once built an empire. His sons rebelled again, this time led by Richard, with Eleanor's blessing. The French king Philip II, son of her old husband Louis, joined the assault. Surrounded, sick, and betrayed, Henry finally surrendered. When he saw the list of rebels and found John's name, his youngest and once beloved son, he reportedly turned his face to the wall and muttered, "Now, let everything end." And it did. Henry died that same year, broken by family and fortune. When the news reached her, Eleanor was released, not in triumph, but in inevitability. The queen who had once shaken thrones stepped back into daylight at nearly 70. And as her chains fell away, so too did the last shadow of Henry's reign. The prisoner was free, and ready to rule once more. When Henry II died, the crown passed to his most formidable heir, Richard the Lionheart, warrior, crusader, and his mother's truest son. His first act as king was not to parade through London or punish his father's allies. It was to free Eleanor of Aquitaine. After 16 years of confinement, she walked out of captivity with the dignity of a woman who had known she'd win eventually. The court gasped. Age had not diminished her presence. At nearly 70, Eleanor still commanded rooms with a glance. She wore her years like armour. And Richard, ever the soldier, understood that his mother's mind was sharper than any general's sword. He made her his co-ruler in practice, if not in title. She governed in his absence, managed his treasury, and brokered peace where his temper could not. But even this new reign carried its share of scandal. Richard's own passions, whispered to include both men and women, fed endless court gossip. His mother ignored it. She'd seen far worse. Instead, she focused on keeping his vast empire from imploding while he chased glory in the Third Crusade. When Richard was captured and held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor, it was Eleanor who saved him. Nearly 80 years old, she rode across the Alps, negotiated with princes, and raised an impossible ransom, 150,000 marks, a sum so vast it nearly bankrupted England. Chroniclers wrote that she moved like a lioness seeking her cub, yet even triumph carried sorrow. While Richard fought and schemed abroad, his younger brother John stirred rebellion at home, whispering that England would be better ruled by him. It was a familiar story, sons turning against mothers, brothers against brothers. Eleanor, weary of dynastic poison, once again found herself standing between loyalty and survival. When Richard finally returned, the people of England celebrated the heroic king. But those who looked closely saw the truth. The empire stood because of his mother's will. She had outlasted 2 kings, rebellions, imprisonment, and scandal, and still held power with nothing but intellect and endurance. In a world that sought to silence her, Eleanor had become the voice of stability, the queen who ruled not by sword, but by sheer unyielding resilience. Even after Richard the Lionheart returned from captivity, Eleanor of Aquitaine knew peace in her family was a luxury she'd never enjoy. Richard's rule brought glory to the battlefield, but chaos to the throne room. His endless campaigns drained the treasury, and his absence left a vacuum that his brother John eagerly filled. The same John who had once betrayed their father and plotted during Richard's imprisonment. Eleanor, ever the strategist, saw through John's charm. He was clever, yes, but also petty, suspicious, and greedy. Where Richard inspired loyalty through valour, John demanded it through fear. Eleanor spent her final years trying to hold together the empire her son seemed determined to destroy. She negotiated truces, calmed nobles, and wrote letters that carried more authority than any royal decree. But for the first time in her long and storied life, she was running out of allies and time. When Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt during a siege in 1199, Eleanor rode to his side. The dying king, ever stoic, told her not to weep. "You gave birth to kings," he said, "and kings do not die with tears." His death shattered what little unity remained in the Angevin dynasty. John seized the throne before Richard's body was even cold. At 77, Eleanor could have retired to a convent. Instead, she mounted her horse once again, travelling across Aquitaine to secure support for her youngest son. Even those who despised John respected her. She was, after all, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a name that still carried the weight of empires. But John's reign quickly descended into intrigue and suspicion. He quarrelled with barons, alienated the church, and betrayed those who had once protected him. Eleanor, wise enough to see the pattern, withdrew gradually from court, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she had raised both lions and jackals. Her last great act came when she arranged the marriage of her granddaughter Blanche of Castile to the French heir, a gesture meant to secure peace between 2 realms long soaked in each other's blood. The old queen had spent her life amid betrayal, scandal, and war, but in her twilight she achieved something her kings never could, a fragile, fleeting peace. And for Eleanor, that was victory enough. By the dawn of the 13th century, Eleanor of Aquitaine had outlived nearly everyone who had ever tried to control her. 2 kings, several lovers, countless enemies, all gone. She remained, a relic of an age she had shaped with her wit and willpower. At almost 80, she was both revered and feared, a living legend whose very name could silence a room. From her residence at Fontevraud Abbey, Eleanor ruled not from a throne, but from correspondence. Her letters moved armies, negotiated treaties, and reconciled estranged nobles. Kings and bishops still sought her counsel, knowing that age had not dulled her instincts. Chroniclers called her a woman whose heart was never conquered, though she had spent her entire life surrounded by men who tried. Yet the whispers never ceased. To the church, she remained suspect, too worldly, too intelligent, too proud. To the poets, she was the embodiment of courtly love, the muse who had made adultery poetic and scandal fashionable. To her descendants, she was a reminder that royal blood often came with a taste for chaos. Her lineage would define Europe for centuries. Through her sons and daughters, she became the ancestor of kings of England, France, and Castile. The great wars that would later tear these kingdoms apart, including the 100 Years' War, could trace their roots back to her dynastic web. Even in death, Eleanor ensured that Europe would never forget her. But it wasn't just her political legacy that endured. She had changed the role of queenship itself. Before her, royal women were pawns. After her, they were players. Eleanor's life had redefined what it meant to be powerful and female in a world ruled by swords and sermons. She ruled through influence, through charm, through intellect, a subtler form of conquest that outlasted every empire her husbands built. In 1204, Eleanor passed away peacefully at Fontevraud, where she was buried beside Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, two men who had loved her, defied her, and never truly escaped her shadow. Her tomb, carved with serene dignity, shows her reading a book. Not a rosary, not a sword, but a story. Fitting, perhaps, for the woman who spent her life rewriting the script of power, scandal, and survival. Long after Eleanor of Aquitaine was laid to rest at Fontevraud Abbey, the French court she had once dazzled continued to live in her shadow. Her name became shorthand for everything that made the 12th century glitter and rot at once. The dangerous mix of passion, politics, and pride that no priest could ever quite cleanse from the kingdom's conscience. In Paris, troubadours still sang of queens who loved too boldly and knights who fell too far. But everyone knew the songs traced their origins to Eleanor's own salons, the courts of love she once held in Poitiers, where noblewomen judged cases of infidelity with the gravity of bishops and the humour of sinners. Those tales of romantic lore became the foundation of chivalry, yet they were born from gossip and scandal. The irony was deliciously medieval. Her descendants inherited not only her lands but her talent for controversy. Her son, John of England, would become infamous for betrayal and tyranny. Her grandson, Louis IX of France, would spend his life trying to sanctify the royal image she had so artfully tarnished. The French chroniclers who came after her couldn't decide whether to condemn or worship her, and so they did both. To some, she was Jezebel in silk. To others, the last great mind before the darkness of war. Even centuries later, writers like Jean Froissart and Christine de Pizan painted her as both sinner and saviour, the woman who turned adultery into art and rebellion into diplomacy. The Church never forgave her independence. Historians never stopped being fascinated by it. She was the scandal that refused to die, and perhaps that was her greatest triumph. While men like Henry and Richard filled chronicles with their battles, Eleanor's battlefield was human nature itself. She ruled not through armies, but through influence, the most enduring weapon of all. By the time the 12th century gave way to the 13th, the ideals of courtly love, political intrigue, and royal scandal had become inseparable from French identity. Behind the hymns and heraldry still lingered the echo of her laughter, the sound of a queen who had outwitted kings, rewritten morality, and made scandal itself a form of immortality.